I found a cabin in the woods that seemed perfect for a weekend getaway. It was remote, with no neighbors for miles, surrounded by tall trees and a peaceful lake. After months of stress, I thought this would be the perfect place to unwind. I arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked my things, and set out to explore the area. The first day went smoothly. I hiked along the lake, breathing in the fresh air and enjoying the solitude. As night fell, I lit a fire in the cabin and settled in with a book. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful and I felt myself relaxing. But as I started to doze off, I heard a faint noise outside. It was a soft thump, like something heavy hitting the ground. I sat up, listening closely. The sound repeated, closer this time, followed by a shuffling noise. My heart raced as I peered through the window, but all I could see was darkness. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Eventually, I convinced myself to go back to sleep, but I left the light on and kept my phone close. The next morning, I checked outside to see if I could find any signs of what had been there. I noticed some broken branches and a few footprints leading away from the cabin, but they didn't look like animal tracks. They were large, almost boot-shaped. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone had hiked by and gotten too close. The day was beautiful, and I spent it hiking, swimming, and enjoying the peace. But as the sun set, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. I locked the doors and windows tightly, trying to push the feeling away. That night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. Thump, shuffling, then silence. I was wide awake now, every nerve in my body on edge. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the noise to return. It did, but this time it was different. It was more frantic, as if something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed to the window. I shined the beam outside, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I turned off the flashlight and returned to bed, telling myself I was just imagining things. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and the noises outside seemed to grow louder. I finally decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and prepared to leave, just as the sun began to rise. As I stepped outside, the air was cool and crisp. I took a deep breath, relieved to be out in the open again. But my relief was short-lived. Right by the door, I saw fresh footprints again. They were bigger than mine, leading away into the woods. I hadn't noticed them before, and they looked like they had been made just that night. Panic gripped me as I scanned the area, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrified. Without wasting another moment, I rushed to my car, throwing my bag in the back seat. My hands shook as I started the engine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing but trees. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a hiker who got too close. Maybe it was nothing. But as I turned onto the main road, I noticed something moving on the edge of the woods. A figure, just standing there, watching my car disappear into the distance. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back in town, far away from that cabin and the unsettling events of the past 2 days. I still think about it often, the way those footprints appeared and the feeling of being watched. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but it turned into a nightmare that I couldn't escape from fast enough. I booked the cabin to get away from it all. Life had been chaotic, and I needed some time alone to clear my head. The place was as remote as it gets. Up in the mountains, surrounded by miles of forest, with no phone signal and no neighbors. It was just me, the trees, and complete silence. The cabin was a small, simple structure. One room with a bed, a fireplace, a kitchenette, and a bathroom. It felt almost too quiet, But after months of city noise, the silence felt like exactly what I needed. I spent the first day hiking nearby trails, exploring the dense woods. As night fell, I returned to the cabin, made a quick meal, and settled into bed early, ready for a long, restful sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a faint, soft crunch of leaves outside. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as I lay there, the sound grew louder, almost rhythmic, like footsteps approaching. My heart started pounding as I listened, waiting for the noise to stop. Didn't. It got closer and then stopped just outside my window. I lay there, holding my breath, not daring to move. There was a long, tense silence, and then I heard a faint scrape against the glass. Just one light drag across the window, enough to make my stomach drop. I stared at the ceiling, forcing myself to breathe, telling myself it was the wind or a branch. In the morning, I went outside to check. Right below the window, there were faint footprints in the dirt, clear impressions, unmistakably human. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I felt a wave of unease, but told myself it was probably just someone passing through. Maybe a hiker who got a bit lost. I shook it off, deciding not to let it ruin my trip. But that night, it happened again. Just after midnight, the footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves just outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening as the sounds circled the cabin, stopping by each window in turn, like someone was inspecting the place. Then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too tense to sleep. In the morning, I found more footprints, fresh ones, circling the cabin just as I'd heard them. I told myself it was a coincidence, maybe even some prank, though I had no idea who would come this far out just to scare someone. I tried to go about my day normally, but the quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold something more. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and went to bed early, hoping the visitor wouldn't return. But around midnight, I heard it. The slow footsteps circling the cabin, pausing at each window. This time, they didn't just stop at the windows. I heard them moving to the door. My whole body went cold as I heard the handle jiggle softly, as if someone were testing to see if it was locked. I lay there, holding my breath, every muscle tense, gripping my flashlight tightly. The handle stopped moving, and the footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. But I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things in the dark, not bothering with the lights, and waited until the first hint of dawn. As soon as it was light enough to see, I hurried to the car, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, my stomach twisted with fear. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, far from the cabin and the strange visitor. I never figured out who was out there or what they wanted, but I still think about it sometimes. That sound of footsteps circling the cabin, the handle slowly turning in the dead of night. When I told the story to a friend later, he said it was probably just a lost hiker or some harmless stranger. But every time I think back to that weekend, I remember the way those footsteps paused, how they lingered at the windows and door, as if they were deciding. I needed a break. Life had been nonstop, and I wanted some time away from people, just to be alone. I found a cabin online that was about as far off the beaten path as you could get. It was surrounded by dense forest, miles from the nearest town. No neighbors, no cell service, just what I was looking for. The drive up there took most of the day, winding through narrow, empty roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was small and a bit run down, with peeling paint and an overgrown path leading up to the front door. Inside, it was simple. A living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. After unpacking, I went outside to stretch my legs. The forest was dark, even with the last bits of daylight streaming through the trees. There was a strange quiet to the place. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, watching. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just on edge from the long drive. But that feeling of being watched clung to me as I headed back inside for the night. I made a simple meal and settled in with a book by the fireplace. Outside, the darkness thickened, and the cabin seemed to grow smaller, surrounded by a sea of black. The fire crackled, breaking the silence, and for a while, I started to relax. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound outside, a soft crunch, like footsteps on gravel. I froze, listening closely. It was faint but distinct, getting closer. My pulse quickened, but I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe it was just an animal. Then the footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, straining to hear. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the handle on the door rattled. My heart pounded, and I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe. The rattling stopped, and I stood there, paralyzed. After what felt like hours, I heard the footsteps retreat, moving away from the cabin and fading into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, feeling like every shadow was alive. When morning finally came, I went outside to look around. The ground was damp, and I saw them immediately. Footprints, deep and fresh, leading up to the door and then back into the trees. They were big, too big to be mine. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I stared at them, wondering who or what had been out there. I decided to stay one more night, convincing myself it had to be a coincidence, maybe a lost hiker. I spent the day close to the cabin, not venturing far into the woods. As the sun started to set, that feeling of unease crept back in. I made sure the doors and windows were locked, feeling a little silly but not wanting to take any chances. Just after midnight, the sounds started again. This time, it was a slow, steady tapping on the window. I sat in bed, frozen, every muscle tense. The tapping was soft but persistent, moving from one window to the next, as if someone was circling the cabin, testing each point of entry. I gripped my flashlight, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It continued, deliberate and slow, until it reached the front door again. There was a long pause, and then, just like the night before, the door handle rattled, harder this time, as if someone was trying to force it open. My mind raced. I didn't know if it was a person or something else, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I grabbed my car keys and decided I'd had enough. I ran to the door, threw it open, and sprinted to my car. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, every shadow watching as I fumbled to unlock the car door, jumped in, and slammed it shut. As I pulled away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. There, standing in the clearing where the cabin was a figure. A person just standing in the moonlight watching me leave. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark outline, tall and still, framed against the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. I told myself I'd never come back, and I haven't. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but that image of the figure standing in the clearing, watching, has stuck with me. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, just watching. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a weekend away. I had been feeling burned out for months and just needed some peace, somewhere to be completely alone. This cabin was far off the main road. No phone signal, no neighbors, and miles from the nearest town. Just me and the quiet. When I got there, it was just afternoon. The cabin looked a little more run down than the pictures online, but I didn't mind. I unloaded my things, then took a walk around the property. It was beautiful out there. The trees were tall and thick, the forest floor covered in a layer of soft moss. The silence was dense, almost overwhelming. I spent the afternoon exploring, finally unwinding as I walked deeper into the woods. My only company, the distant rustle of leaves. I was back inside the cabin as dusk set in, and it grew dark quickly. I started a fire in the small fireplace, made myself a simple meal, and settled into an armchair with a book. The silence felt heavier at night, the cabin small and closed in, with nothing but the flickering of the fire to keep me company. Around midnight, I heard a faint knock. I froze, every nerve on edge. It was just one knock, barely audible, but distinct. I held still, listening, but I didn't hear it again. I brushed it off as my imagination, probably the house settling or the wind catching the wood. I tried to read again, but my focus was gone. Then, an hour or so later, I heard it again. Another knock, this time a little louder, just 2 quick taps. My heartbeat picked up. I was certain it wasn't my imagination this time. I went over to the window, peering out, but I could only see the dark outline of the trees, shifting in the wind. No one was there. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and return to my chair, telling myself it had to be an animal outside or a branch hitting the cabin. But the noise didn't stop. For the next hour, the knocking came and went. Sometimes it was faint, barely there. Other times a clear, hard tap against the wood. It was moving too, coming from different sides of the cabin. The sound would shift from one wall to the next, as if something or someone was circling the place, knocking every few minutes. By then, I was wide awake, my nerves frayed. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I even grabbed a kitchen knife just in case, though I felt ridiculous. I tried to reason with myself that it was nothing serious, probably some curious animal sniffing around the cabin. But every time I started to relax, the knocking would start up again, this time from a different part of the cabin. Finally, just before dawn, the knocking stopped. The silence was almost worse. I sat there, gripping the knife, jumping at every little creak and pop from the old cabin. When daylight finally broke, I decided I couldn't stay another night. When I stepped outside, everything felt strangely still, almost too quiet. I walked around the cabin, hoping to find tracks or some sign of what had been there. What I found were footprints, big, clear boot prints pressed into the dirt all around the cabin. They circled the entire place, weaving back and forth, stopping at each window, each door. The prints were fresh, damp from the morning dew, and there was no mistaking they were human. I felt a shiver go through me as I realized whoever had been there had taken their time, methodically moving from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing at each spot where they could look in, watching. I didn't wait to find out if they were still around. I packed my things as quickly as I could and threw everything in the car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dense forest. I never found out who it was or why they were there, but I think about that night often. I went up there looking for peace and quiet, a chance to be alone. And I got exactly what I wanted, except I wasn't alone at all. I needed to get away. The city felt suffocating, so I booked a cabin deep in the woods, hours away from the nearest town. The pictures online made it look peaceful and quiet, exactly what I needed to clear my head. The drive was long and winding, and by the time I arrived, it was nearly sunset. The cabin looked smaller than in the photos, a plain wooden structure surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. It was isolated, too. The nearest house was probably miles away. Perfect, I thought. I wanted to be alone. The first night was uneventful. I settled in, got a fire going, and ate a simple meal. The silence out here was different, almost too complete. There were no sounds of traffic, no hum of distant conversations, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was unsettling at first, but eventually, I relaxed and fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside the cabin. It was faint, just a light tapping, like something or someone was brushing against the wall. I lay still, listening, my heart starting to pound. But the sound faded, and after a while, I convinced myself it was just an animal. I drifted back to sleep, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The next morning, I stepped outside to check things out. The grass was damp from the night, and as I walked around the cabin, I noticed footprints. They were faint, but definitely human, circling around the cabin and stopping right below the bedroom window. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably from a hiker who'd passed by. After all, people did use the trails out here. I shook it off and went about my day, hiking a bit, reading, and doing my best to ignore the lingering unease. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing sounds outside, small, almost imperceptible scratches against the wood, like fingers lightly tapping. I stayed in bed, heart racing, too afraid to move. Every time I thought the sounds had stopped, they'd start up again, moving around the cabin, pausing, then starting up somewhere else. I hardly slept, and the next morning, I checked the ground around the cabin again. This time, the footprints were clear and fresh, pressed deeply into the mud from the night's rain. And they weren't from a hiker. They circled the cabin once again, stopping in the exact same places as before, right under the windows near the front door. I decided to leave that day. I'd had enough of whatever was going on out there. I packed my things quickly, feeling exposed as I loaded up the car. As I was about to leave, I took one last look at the cabin, just to be sure I hadn't missed anything. That's when I saw it. Wedged into the doorframe was a small piece of paper, dirty and damp. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The message was simple, written in shaky handwriting. "I've been watching you. Please leave." A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been there, close enough to slip this note into the door without me noticing. My mind flashed back to the sounds in the night, the footprints in the mud. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever it was had been here, waiting, watching me through the windows. I didn't waste any more time. I got into my car and drove, not looking back until I hit the main road. I didn't stop until I was hours away, back in the outskirts of the city, where the hum of cars and the noise of people felt strangely comforting. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. Even now, though, sometimes I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just watching. I'd been needing some time away, so I rented a cabin up in the mountains, far from the noise of the city. It was an old place, a bit run down, but it was perfect, just what I wanted. Isolated, quiet, surrounded by thick woods, with only a gravel road leading up to it. I planned to spend a few days there, just unwinding, reading, maybe hiking a bit. I got to the cabin in the early afternoon, the sun still high, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was simple but cozy, with a small kitchen, a main room with a fireplace, and a bedroom at the back. I unpacked, got a fire going, and settled into the old armchair by the window, looking out at the thick line of trees surrounding the place. As the evening crept in, I went outside for a walk. The woods were dense, darker than I'd expected, and strangely silent. I didn't hear any birds, just the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. The silence felt a bit off, like the forest was watching me, waiting. I pushed that thought away and walked back to the cabin, feeling a little on edge, but telling myself it was just the quiet getting to me. I ate a simple dinner, And as night fell, the cabin grew dark and heavy. There were no streetlights out here, no noise, just the hum of insects and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and went to bed, thinking I'd sleep easily with all that quiet. But then I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like something scraping along the outside of the cabin. My eyes shot open, and I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The sound was soft but steady, a gentle scratching against the wood, moving slowly around the cabin. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something looking for food, but I couldn't shake the unease growing in my chest. Then, the scratching stopped, and everything went silent. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. Just as I started to relax, I heard it again. Footsteps this time. Slow, deliberate crunching on the gravel outside. Someone was out there. I held my breath, trying to listen, trying to figure out where the footsteps were coming from. They circled around to the back of the cabin, stopped, then started again, moving toward the front. I forced myself out of bed, tiptoeing to the small window in the bedroom. I peeked out, but all I could see were shadows stretching across the gravel in the moonlight. There was no one there, but I could still hear the footsteps, closer now, just outside the front door. I felt trapped, knowing I was alone, with no one to call, no help nearby. The footsteps stopped right at the front door. I backed away from the window, trying to steady my breathing. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, to not draw any attention. The door handle jiggled slightly, a soft metallic sound in the silence. My heart felt like it was going to pound out of my chest. I held still, listening, waiting, hoping whoever it was would just go away. Then silence again. I stood there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. The cabin was completely still, and I didn't hear any more footsteps. Eventually, I forced myself to check the locks again, making sure everything was secure. I tried to go back to bed, but I barely slept, just lying there, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, I went outside, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked around, I saw them. Footprints, clear in the soft dirt, leading all around the cabin. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window, each door. The prints were large, clearly from a pair of boots, not from any animal. I didn't want to think about what that meant. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag without even bothering to fold anything. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, away from whatever or whoever had been outside my cabin that night. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me and the dense trees on either side. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who had been out there that night or what they wanted. All I know is someone had been watching me, circling the cabin, standing right outside my door in the middle of the night. I don't think I'll ever forget that feeling. The way the silence of the woods went from peaceful to suffocating. The way my skin prickled knowing I was alone but not really alone. Even now, sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I'm back in that cabin, listening to those footsteps outside the door. I needed a break from everything. The stress of work had been building up for months, and I just wanted to get away. My friend Mike had told me about a cabin his family owned, way out in the woods. It wasn't fancy, but it was isolated, and that's all I cared about. A few days out there with no people, no emails, no noise, it sounded perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. The highway turned into a narrow road, which eventually gave way to a dirt path that twisted through the trees. By the time I got to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place looked run down but sturdy. It had that look of a building no one had used in years. The paint was peeling and the windows were smudged, but I didn't mind. It was exactly what I wanted. Quiet and completely off the grid. I got inside and unpacked. The cabin was small, just a living room with an old couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom with a bed that looked like it had seen better days. The air was cool and everything had a musty smell, like it had been shut up for a long time. I opened a window to let in some fresh air, and then decided to explore the area before it got dark. The woods around the cabin were thick, with trees so tall they blocked out most of the sky. I walked for about half an hour, following what looked like a game trail, just listening to the sound of my footsteps and the occasional bird. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city. The peace out here was different, though. It was deep, almost too quiet. It made me feel small, like I was the only person for miles, which was probably true. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. There was a narrow path in the dirt near the side of the building, like someone had walked through there recently. It was faint, but the ground was disturbed. The odd thing was, it wasn't near the main road or where I had parked. I hadn't noticed it when I first arrived, but maybe I just wasn't paying attention. I shook it off and went back inside, made myself a sandwich and got a fire going. The sun was starting to set, and the cabin felt cozy with the firelight flickering across the walls. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself relax. After eating, I settled into the couch with a book I'd brought. Outside, the wind started to pick up, making the trees creak and sway, but inside, everything was calm. That feeling didn't last long. I was reading, minding my own business, when I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a crunch, like footsteps on gravel, coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. I stopped reading and listened. There it was again, this time closer. My heart started to race. I wasn't expecting anyone out here. No one even knew I was here except for Mike, and he was hundreds of miles away. I stood up and went to the window, peeking through the glass, but all I could see were shadows and trees swaying in the wind. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. For a minute, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the crackling fire behind me. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it again, this time from the front of the cabin. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Someone or something was moving around outside. I backed away from the window and grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, which happened to be the fireplace poker. My hands were shaking, but I told myself to stay calm. Minutes passed, but the footsteps stopped again. I stood there, gripping the poker, trying to decide what to do. The cabin felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. I kept listening, expecting to hear the door creak open or the windows rattle, but nothing happened. Finally, I forced myself to move. I checked the door, it was locked. I went to the other windows, but there was no sign of anyone outside. The fire was starting to die down, so I added more wood, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat back down, poker still in hand, my eyes darting between the windows. Hours passed, and the wind outside grew stronger, but the footsteps never came back. The fire burned low, and I finally dozed off, exhaustion getting the better of me. I woke up early the next morning, stiff and uneasy. The cabin was cold, and the fire had long since burned out. I looked around, trying to shake off the fear from the night before. Felt like a bad dream, but it had been real. The footsteps had been real. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air, and walked around the cabin. The ground was damp from the dew, and I saw them, footprints. Human footprints, leading from the back of the cabin to the front porch. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, too clear to be from an old visitor. Someone had been there last night. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever it was had been walking around while I was inside, watching, waiting, and they hadn't tried to break in or make themselves known. They just walked away, leaving me alone. I didn't wait to figure out who it had been or why they were there. I packed up my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. The drive back down the dirt road felt like it took forever, but I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I never told Mike what happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. But I haven't gone back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. It wasn't the footsteps that scared me the most. It was the fact that whoever was out there never made themselves known. They didn't want to be seen, and that's what I'll never forget. I decided to take a break from everything. Work was getting too much, and I just needed a few days away. A friend of mine had mentioned an old cabin up in the mountains. Said it was a good spot to clear your head. Sounded perfect. No people, no noise, just me and the woods. So I packed a bag, threw it in the back of my car, and drove out. The road got rougher the closer I got, turning from pavement to gravel and then to dirt. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, the sun hanging low behind the trees. The cabin looked exactly like I expected. Small, a little worn down, but nothing too bad. It sat in a clearing surrounded by thick forest, with no one around for miles. I got out, stretched, and took a good look around. The air was cool and quiet. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the front door, which creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was simple: an old couch, a small table, a fireplace. A door led to the bedroom, which had nothing but a bed and a small window. It wasn't fancy, but it was all I needed. After settling in, I decided to walk around before it got dark. The forest was dense, the kind that made you feel like you were far away from the rest of the world. I followed a path for a while, listening to the leaves crunch under my feet, enjoying the quiet. It was peaceful, but there was something strange about it. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd stop and look around, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I headed back to the cabin as the sun started to set. By the time I got there, the light was fading and the woods were getting darker. I started a fire in the fireplace, sat down on the couch, and tried to relax. But that feeling stuck with me. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see something or someone out there. But the night was still. After a while, I convinced myself it was just nerves. I wasn't used to being this isolated. So I went to bed, figuring I'd feel better in the morning. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It was faint, but I could hear it, like something moving outside. Footsteps, maybe? I listened harder, hoping I was imagining it. But then I heard it again, soft, slow footsteps crunching in the dirt, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. Someone was out there. My mind raced. No one was supposed to be here. I hadn't seen anyone on the way up, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. My heart pounded harder as the footsteps got closer, moving toward the side of the cabin. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes passed, but nothing. No more footsteps, no sounds at all. Just the wind and the crackling of the dying fire. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe I'd imagined it. I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around. I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of someone or something that might have been there. Then I saw them. Footprints, clear in the dirt around the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. Someone had been there last night, walking around while I was inside. I stood there for a moment, staring at them, trying to figure out what to do. The prints led away into the woods, but I had no idea where they went. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but something kept me there. I convinced myself it was probably just a hiker passing through, maybe someone who got lost. Still, the thought of someone being that close to me in the middle of the night was unsettling. I decided to stay one more night. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was nothing, that I'd be fine. I spent the rest of the day close to the cabin, chopping wood, keeping busy, trying not to think about the footprints. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. The fire was burning, and I tried to relax on the couch, but I couldn't shake the tension. My mind kept drifting back to those footsteps, the idea that someone had been so close without me knowing. I eventually fell asleep there by the fire, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a noise outside, a sharp crack like a branch breaking. I sat up, wide awake now, heart racing again. I didn't move, just listened. Footsteps again. This time they were faster, moving quickly around the side of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and knife I had brought with me and crept to the window. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just like before. I shone the flashlight out the window, but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. The silence stretched on, and my nerves were shot. I backed away from the window, trying to figure out what to do. Then I heard the creak of the porch. Someone or something was right outside the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, threw everything into it, and bolted for the back door. I wasn't waiting around to see who or what was out there. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I jumped into my car and tore down the dirt road, not looking back until I hit the highway. Only then did I stop to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my hands shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never found out who was out there that night or why they were walking around the cabin. But one thing was clear. They weren't just passing through. They had been there watching, waiting. I haven't told anyone about it. I haven't even been back to the cabin. I don't plan to. Something was wrong out there, something I couldn't explain, and I'm not interested in finding out what it was. I had always liked the idea of getting away from everything, and the old cabin seemed perfect for that. It wasn't far from the city, but remote enough that no one would be around. My friend Jake had mentioned it to me, said his uncle used to own it before he sold it to some guy who barely ever came by. Jake said I could crash there if I wanted some time to myself. So, I packed up a few things and headed out. The road turned to gravel pretty quickly, then narrowed as the trees grew denser. No cell service, just the hum of my car and the crunch of rocks under the tires. I finally saw the cabin after about an hour of driving through the woods. It was small, a little run down, but still standing. The kind of place where you could imagine chopping wood in the morning, drinking coffee by the fire. The door stuck when I opened it, but inside wasn't as bad as I expected. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch near a cold fireplace. It smelled like wood and dirt, but nothing too unpleasant. After looking around, I dropped my bag and went out to explore the area. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. There were tracks, shoe prints, leading from the back of the cabin to the woods. They looked fresh, not more than a day old. That was odd because no one was supposed to be out here. Maybe it was the guy who owned the place? I shrugged it off and kept walking, trying to enjoy the quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting and the shadows were long and dark. I started a fire, hoping the crackling warmth would settle my nerves. It helped for a while. I made a sandwich and sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside. But every now and then, I thought I heard something else. A soft rustling, like footsteps in the leaves, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just animals or the wind playing tricks on me. It was getting late, and I figured I should try to sleep. The couch wasn't comfortable, but it was better than nothing. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the fire slowly dying down. The wind outside had picked up, making the trees sway and creak. But then I heard it again, that sound. Footsteps. This time they were closer, definitely human. I sat up and listened. The footsteps were coming from the side of the cabin, near the back where I'd seen those tracks earlier. My heart started pounding. I didn't have a weapon, just a flashlight and a kitchen knife, neither of which made me feel any safer. I sat there, frozen, listening as the footsteps came around to the front porch. I couldn't see anything through the small windows, but I could hear the wood creaking under the weight of someone stepping onto the porch. Then silence. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, my muscles tensed, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No knock, no voice, no more footsteps. After what felt like forever, I slowly got up and crept to the window, peeking out through a corner of the curtain. The porch was empty. I don't know what I expected to see, but the emptiness made my skin crawl. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, just the empty porch bathed in faint moonlight. I wanted to believe I had imagined the whole thing, but those footsteps had been real. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat by the dying fire, knife in hand, staring at the door until the first light of morning broke through the windows. The footsteps hadn't returned, and the night had stayed quiet after that moment. But something still felt wrong, like I had come too close to something I shouldn't have. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother cleaning up, just grabbed my stuff and got in the car. The road felt longer on the way back, the trees denser, the shadows darker, but I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe it was nothing at all. But the feeling that someone had been watching, that they had stood just a few feet away from me while I sat there helpless in that cabin, has stuck with me ever since. I haven't been back. I'd never been one to believe in bad luck or curses. The cabin was just that, a cabin. It had been sitting untouched for years on a stretch of land my uncle used to own. When he passed, it went to me. It felt like the kind of place people say has character. But that's just another way of saying it's old and needs work. But I figured a weekend out there could do me some good, away from everything. Just me and the quiet. The drive out was longer than I remembered. No cell service, no GPS after a certain point, just an old map I'd printed off the computer. The road turned to gravel, then dirt. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the trees closed in on both sides. When I finally saw the cabin up ahead, it was smaller than I expected. The roof sagged a bit, and the front porch was covered in dead leaves and branches, but it wasn't falling apart. I got out, grabbed my bag, and pushed the door open. Creaked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. Inside, it smelled like damp wood, but everything seemed intact, just dusty. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living room with an old fireplace straight ahead, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom. The windows were grimy, letting in only a dull light. I tossed my stuff on the couch and went out to gather some firewood from a stack I'd seen on the side of the cabin. As I was walking back, I noticed something odd. There were footprints leading from the side of the cabin toward the woods. They were faint, probably old, but still visible in the dirt. I stopped and stared at them for a second, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hiker passed through here, I thought. The trail wasn't far off, but these didn't seem fresh. I pushed it out of my mind and got the fire going. The warmth felt good. I made myself a sandwich and settled into an old chair near the fireplace. The wood crackled, and the night settled in. No sounds except the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But then came that feeling, you know the one, when something doesn't sit right, when your brain picks up on things before you do. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered. I told myself it was just being alone in a strange place. The fire was dying down, and I decided to turn in for the night. I shut the door to the bedroom, crawled into the old bed, and closed my eyes. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was nothing, but I sat up in the dark, listening. My eyes adjusted slowly, making out the shape of the room, the window across from me, the dim outline of the door. And then I heard it, soft, barely there, but unmistakable. Footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate. My heart started to race. I held my breath, straining to hear. They stopped, then started again, this time closer. I slid out of bed and moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Peeking through the dirty glass, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. But the footsteps continued. They were coming from the front of the cabin now, right by the porch. I crept to the bedroom door and opened it just a crack. The front door was in view, still shut, but something was off. The lock. I swore I had locked it before going to bed. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, maybe watching, maybe waiting. My mind raced. I wasn't armed. My phone was useless out here. Running into the woods in the dark was a death sentence. I had to stay calm. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and stood there, listening for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and the silence stretched on. Finally, I walked to the door and slowly locked it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting near the fire with the poker in my hand, eyes on the door. Nothing happened. No more footsteps, no noises, just the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, just out of sight. By morning, I was exhausted, but the sun brought some relief. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin. As I backed my car out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, someone, but the cabin just sat there, quiet and still. As I drove away, I glanced one last time at the side of the cabin where I'd seen the footprints. They were gone, smoothed over like they'd never been there. I didn't look back again.